Hi, my name is Johannes Gruber. I am currently a postdoc researcher at the Chair for Digital Democracy at the European New School of Digital Studies. In the talk today, I want to present my paper called Troublemakers in the Streets, which is an examination of newspaper coverage of protest from 1992 till 2017 in the UK, as the title suggests. Starting with the research puzzle. I believe that protest is inherently important for democracy as it enables citizens to give direct feedback to those in power. Even relatively powerless groups can make their voices heard, contribute to the diversity of the marketplace of ideas, and foster social change. However, to have an impact, protesters need to get media attention, as their audience will otherwise only consist of the few bystanders that an event can attract. And most protests don't. Furthermore, even when protests attract media attention, protesters and scholars agree that they often attract the wrong kind of attention. The media focuses on things like clashes between protesters and police and violence during a protest, and not on the cause and grievances of the protesters. This leads to the main theoretical concept in the field, which is the protest paradigm. Basically, the scholarship assumes that there is a common mindset or worldview among journalists that leads to a standard reply to all protests, as the paradigm tells reporters where to look and what to find. If this is true, scholars like McLeod and Hertog suggest that protests tend to get delegitimized and made to appear much smaller and more deviant than they actually are through the media lens. So, what evidence do we have for the protest paradigm? There is a somewhat large body of studies that are reviewed, and the majority, but not all, of the studies suggest that the protest paradigm exists and shapes coverage of protest. As you can see in the table, it is really the majority of studies which support the protest paradigm, but we have a few which only partly support it or outright reject it. Unfortunately, this disagreement might be due to several gaps in our knowledge. First, most of the studies that I reviewed are rather narrow case studies that focus often just on one radical protest or a few protests about one issue. And there's a lack of longitudinal studies, which is especially problematic as the theory is quite old and arguably a lot has changed in protest organization, journalistic routines, and the wider society in the last 30 years. And there are a couple of other problems that are not that important here. The key points about the case are that instead of a narrow case study, I included all reports about all protests in the UK, and I included a long time frame to capture said changes that happened over the decades. I also included tabloid and broadsheet news media as well as left and right-wing newspaper outlets. This provided me with a sample of more than 27,000 newspaper articles. I was guided by the two research questions below, which focus on how do British newspapers frame protest coverage and how did patterns change over time. Moving on to the method. I used framing in this research as it provides a clear path for operationalization of the protest paradigm. I do not understand the paradigm as one particular frame, but rather as a collection of delegitimizing frames. I use the definition by Entman here since it is the most widely employed. To frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in the communication text. So far, so good. The second part, however, is not as often quoted, and it is crucial for my method here. Specifically, I decided to not code frames directly, but instead to code frame elements, specifically the frame elements that Entman has suggested in his definition. I code problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and treatment separately, and those can come either from the literature or inductively from the material, which I think is a huge advantage of this method. I coded these frame elements in a training set of 500 randomly selected articles, and I validated the manual coding with additional coders. Only then I used factor analysis to identify the actual frames. And the method not only suggests frames, but also the number of main frames that make up a discussion. Only once the frames are identified, they are coded through supervised machine learning in the entire set of documents, which I said is more than 27,000 newspapers. There's more about the method in my thesis, and I'm currently working on a paper to describe the frame analysis approach in more detail. Moving on to the most interesting part of the paper, the results. As I said, I identified frames by first coding frame elements in a random set of newspapers and then performing factor analysis. I interpreted the frames that this produced by looking at factor loadings, and in this plot you can see on the left-hand side the content analysis codes, and then the higher the factor loading, the more important one of these codes was for a frame. So as you can see here, the Troublemakers frame, which I named because the most important code here is violence and crime, as well as making protesters responsible for it and saying that public safety was endangered, as well as property was destroyed. Furthermore, the treatment recommendation is that protesters should stop and basically go home. As you can see, the analysis produced 7 main frames, and of those I can clearly say that law and order, troublemakers, decay of morals, and nuisance are linked to the protest paradigm. However, I have 2 distinctly legitimizing frames, which are cause and grievances, which mainly describes the cause of a protest and makes officials responsible for grievances, and a second frame, which is righteous struggle. Those 2 frames noticeably depart from the protest paradigm. And then there is a 7th frame, the police violence frame, which focuses on describing how police behave during a protest. This does not necessarily hurt protesters, but on the other hand, the focus on clash between protest and the police takes attention away from the cause and grievances. Then, as I said, I performed machine learning to code the entire set of newspaper articles, and as you can see here in the F1 score column, the results were actually pretty good. Usually you rarely get results that are better than 0.8, and here all of the results are above this value and some are even above 0.9 or 0.94. So we can say that the method performed pretty reliably. This leads me to my main results: the share of articles in each year which use the frames. Each article might use more than 1 frame, which is why these numbers do add to more than 100%. What we see is that for the most part, frames display no systematic change over time. Most of the frames fluctuate but arrive at basically the same level in 2017 that they had in 1992. Even the police violence frame, which saw a huge spike after police killed a man during the G20 summit protests in London in 2009, returned to the same level as before only a few years later. What is obvious that in no year did one of the frames dominate. Instead, there was always a mix between frames, and while the delegitimizing frames taken together are always in the majority, the 2 legitimizing frames in blue have taken up substantial share each year. In a more systematic analysis, I found that indeed only the shares of 2 frames display a significant trend over time. I ran a simple linear regression and I found that cause and grievances and righteous struggle are used significantly more often over time. By 2014, cause and grievances even surpassed all other individual frames. What this means is that while delegitimizing frames together are still present in the majority of articles about protest, legitimizing frames are used more often over time. So what does that mean? The broad data set means that my analysis provided a more systematic and generalizable picture. The method I developed helps me to understand framing in a much broader database than previous studies while keeping true to the concept, I think. It also helped me to identify the frames in the dataset, as I said, 7 of them, rather than relying on old and possibly outdated findings. To answer my 2 research questions, I found that a majority of articles keeps using delegitimizing frames. So the mainstream news media in Britain continues to use the protest paradigm in a majority of articles. However, a substantial and growing number of articles also employs legitimizing frames departing from this tradition. What does it mean for protest? Overall, protest is not delegitimized as systematically as suggested by, for example, McLeod and Hertog. Protest is also more often taken seriously over time in the UK. However, this doesn't mean much for individual protests, which might only receive 1 or 2 articles covering them and might still completely rely on delegitimizing coverage. And there might be specific goals which are systematically marginalized by the British press. But I leave this for another paper. So thank you for your attention. If you want to learn more about my research, follow me on Twitter or visit my website. And if you have any questions about the presentation today, then just pop me an email. Thanks and goodbye.